I think one thing we need to understand is that in America they claim there are no political prisoners. So our struggle is, on the one hand, of course, always to free our political prisoners, and at all stages in the conflict to raise that as a demand, but also to demand that they have political status, that they are recognized as political prisoners and not treated as criminals. And are afforded different sorts of rights and other things that I think are due to them and that are important to them. And I think all over the world, in Palestine, in Northern Ireland, this is one of the major struggles they wage, is for political status. And I think that's something we should think about as we go forward here to 2014. Free all political prisoners, of course, but definitely we need to continue to raise this issue of political status, because there are political prisoners in the United States of America, and that needs to be recognized by the government. It's not our government, but the government that oppresses us. So I'll say here briefly, and I know this is a crowd, maybe I don't even need to say this to, a very advanced, intelligent grouping of people, that mass incarceration as a system and how we understand it is important. And it's relevant to political prisoners, because many people who talk about mass incarceration don't give that angle, that these law and order politics that underlie the imprisonment of millions and millions of people found their original genesis in America as part of a war against the Black liberation movement. Getting quote-unquote tough on crime was a part and parcel of this issue of attempting to criminalize political movements that was deliberately undertaken by the Nixon administration to make it seem as if radical political activity was the exact same thing as criminality of any sort. That if you were a Black Panther, you were just as bad as a rapist. I mean, that is essentially the equality they wanted to put forward. You know, I went to Howard University, and a brother once told me that he went to, I guess, some sort of orientation for the FBI. They have these very frequently on that campus, FBI, NSA, CIA, they're all recruiting very heavily, particularly if you take Arabic languages. Think about that. And that someone had raised the question to this recruiter from the FBI, well, you know, many of us here, we respect the Black Panther Party, and, you know, we want you to address the FBI's criminality as it concerned the Black Panthers. And the guy was very slick. He said something like, well, we understand that the FBI had made some mistakes. I don't know if it was really a mistake, but okay, that is what it is. But we have to recognize, and you have to recognize, is that they were breaking the law, so we had to do something. But you know, even Gandhi said that if the law is unjust, no one should follow that law. And so in that case, criminality and revolutionary activity are not the same. But this issue of getting tough on crime originally comes from that COINTELPRO, which is, we talk a lot about COINTELPRO, really a war on the Black liberation movement. And I think it's important to stress that war aspect. And I think it's crucial that we remember this, because it speaks to the entire function of what mass incarceration is, or has been and will continue to be, which is frankly just a method of social control. There was a war on the Black liberation movement. The organizations of the Black liberation movement were attacked and suppressed. Their leaders and cadres were imprisoned. And then in the wake of all of that, we have this country going through a period where, moving after this so-called period of prosperity, you know, everyone moving to the suburbs and all that kind of thing, and this idea that everyone could kind of be brought along and brought into this American standard of living. And even during the civil rights movement, some of the government officials said, we'll even get Black people in there. You know, you go to the suburbs, get you a good job, we'll get you in there, don't worry. There was a change, and I won't go into the deep thing, but essentially there was a change, and ultimately, instead of providing any sort of decent life, infrastructure, positive living standards, education, any of these things for the so-called inner cities, the so-called ghettos of America, the oppressed nations in this country, they decided to essentially imprison them instead. Because you had a situation whereby millions of people were being shut out of all meaningful living standards, at least from the point of view of what it means to have such in a capitalist society. They were being completely shut out, giving no options by the powers that be. And you can't, from their perspective, from the perspective of a capitalist system where you ultimately need stability to make profits, that you can't just leave people there. And why can't you just have all these people? I mean, you've oppressed them and you've suppressed their leaders, but it was only 20 years before, if we look at mass incarceration rising in the 80s, that these same communities had risen up and shook the whole world, the whole entire world. I mean, there's many organizations, but if you reference the Black Panther Party and look at history, all over the world, people started raising up their own Black Panther parties. When Malcolm X was touring the world, he had such an impact, and many of you know this story. When John Lewis was in Africa as director of SNCC, all they wanted to know in the African liberation movements is, where do you stand in relationship to Malcolm X? Because they knew he was a revolutionary freedom fighter. So this is the impact that the Black liberation struggle had had. And so if you're going to create in this community, these sorts of communities, this sort of oppression, what we know, and if we understand it dialectically, is that oppression breeds resistance. And so if you want to stop that resistance from eventually rising up, from continuing rising from the ashes of what was previously defeated, what had previously almost defeated you, you know, in the... in 1967, and this is a little aside, but I'll get back to it and I'll finish really quickly. When they did a tally of all the people who had been arrested as snipers shooting at the police in the Detroit uprising, they found actually more white people had been arrested than black people shooting at the police, which is an interesting fact, because that means that the uprising of black people in Detroit was so powerful that even white people, some of whom were racist, were inspired to rise up against the same system that they felt was also oppressing them, which speaks to the power of the Black liberation movement in this country. And it's not really a coincidence that all progressive movements, I mean, whether it was the Civil War, where there was a progressive period, the so-called 60s civil rights movement, it was the struggle of black people that inspired all the other struggles and continues to today. So the final point I want to make is that this is the genesis of mass incarceration. You see mass incarceration start to rise right at the moment where it becomes 100% clear that black people in this country, that as well as Latinos and other oppressed people, were going to continue to be confined for the purposes of this capitalist economic system to these terrible social conditions. They weren't going to do anything, and they knew they had to cut the head off the snake prior to it rising back up, and thus we see mass incarceration. Millions of black people, Latino people, Native people. You go to South Dakota, most of the people in prison are Native. They say, oh, there's no black people in South Dakota. Well, they find the Native people who they're oppressing terribly. They throw them in prison to prevent organizations, movements, leadership from rising, and to sow and create division and destitution in the community to continue to keep them down. And I think as we go forward and we think about in 2014, at the precipice of a new year, this struggle against mass incarceration, and all of us in here, we have many struggles as revolutionaries. We know we fight on many different fronts. We have to continue to remember our political prisoners, because it was their struggle that was brutally, brutally, brutally repressed with murder and all of these terrible things that really directly led to mass incarceration, because their defeat was what led to the conditions that made them feel they needed to establish a mass prison system to oppress us. So there's a direct link between the two, and I'll just go right back to one final thing. In Northern Ireland, a very famous political prisoner, Bobby Sands, and just before Bobby Sands died, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and Sinn Féin, they ran him for office in the European Parliament. The thought being that it would raise the profile of him as a political prisoner, and that perhaps the Thatcher government in England at the time would not execute someone who was in, or would not allow someone to die. He was on a hunger strike, who was in this parliament, and perhaps they'd have to release him from prison. And nevertheless, he died on a hunger strike. But the point I want to make is I think that's a powerful thing when we look forward at the election process in America, because we have so little consciousness, people in this country, about political prisoners. There is so little done to support them. I think we should start using some of these election processes on multiple levels. Instead of putting in these same people who oppress us in some of these areas, we should use them to raise up political prisoners, just like they did in Northern Ireland, and so that on the ballot, all over the cities, all over the streets, on the news media, with stand-ins and all the different election forums, the issue of freedom of political prisoners can be raised over and over and over again. I think this is one of our most important struggles. We have to continue at all events to raise freedom for all the political prisoners. I wrote a book, Shackled